The clerk will please read the next bill.
Senate Bill 710 relating to judicial training.
Recognize Senator Sollman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I rise before you today in support of Senate Bill 710. As a senator and a board member of the Family Justice Center of Washington County, I have heard from numerous advocates and survivors that improvements to the family court system are critically needed. The stories are traumatic to hear. In order to protect children and survivors of abuse and domestic violence, we must have better training and awareness for our judges all across Oregon. It can have dire consequences if they do not have this trauma-informed training. The testimony heard in the committee was very impactful from our judges. As a survivor myself of domestic violence, growing up in a home where domestic violence was a traumatic and constant pattern, I understand this pain and fear and critical safety for young children. I was very fearful of outcomes during my parents' divorce proceedings back in the early 80s. I was not certain if visitation would be required, and that terrified me. Thankfully, my dad did not push for visitation or for custody. In 2023, I brought forward a bill called Caden's Law. The sole focus was about keeping children safe from family violence. This was a bill based off a tragic story in Pennsylvania that saw a young child, Caden, murdered by her abusive father during an unsupervised court visit, despite the court's knowledge of the father's history of violent and threatening behavior. A portion of Caden's Law would have mandated judicial education so that judges would receive initial and ongoing training on domestic violence and child abuse in order to help prevent further tragedies like Caden's from occurring. That bill did not move forward, but since then I've been working with advocates and survivors alongside the Family Justice Center of Washington County, Oregon Law Center, and the Oregon Judicial Department on a concept focused on that judicial training piece. The advocates all agree that judicial training is an important first step in addressing the trauma and safety for DV and sexual assault survivors. But we have much more work to do. Reopening trauma is not easy for anyone. And in our search for positive change, we ask survivors to come back again and again and again to share their stories. I'd like to leave you with a personal testimony from a survivor who shared this with me and gave me their permission to have it be read out loud. And I quote, "Thank you for considering Senate Bill 710. This legislation is crucial for survivors like me who have endured the family court system. After divorcing my husband, an attorney in Washington County, I was granted joint custody of our 2 young children while pregnant with a third. He weaponized the legal system against me, filing frivolous motions to drain my finances and continue his control of us, dragging me to court over the things like emergency medical care for our child, and even attempted to stop me from breastfeeding. Though he rarely prevailed, he was always awarded attorney's fees that I had to pay. And the system never stopped to ask why someone like him might be doing this, always writing it off as a he said, she said situation. He continued this relentless legal harassment for years, until, with the help of the judicial colleague, took custody of our children. Though I was granted visitation, he refused, forcing me to return to court every time I wanted to see them, until he finally bankrupted me. It was not until 2006 when my children, not the courts, finally put an end to it by cutting off contact with him. The damage remains. My relationship with my children is fractured, and I had to rebuild my life from nothing. Over a decade in the courts, only one judge ever reprimanded him for his abuse of the system, a failure that has left lasting scars. Had this bill been in place, judges would have been trained to recognize how perpetrators abused, manipulated, and weaponized the court system. They would have been trained about the effects of trauma on survivors and how the justice system easily triggers and adds to this trauma. They would have been trained to recognize the traumatic and dangerous effects of being caught up in the justice system was for the children and the lasting damage that had been done to their relationships with parents. Most of all, they would have been trained to identify abuse, listen to, and to believe survivors. This bill is so important to help survivors' safety navigate the system, be heard, and be treated with the dignity and respect, unquote. Thank you to this survivor for adding their personal and traumatic story. I am humbled by this work and the people that I have had the opportunity to work alongside. Thank you to Rachel Schutz, the Executive Director from the Family Justice Center of Washington County, the Oregon Law Center, OJD, and the countless survivors that worked on this policy alongside our office to lead to this positive change. Colleagues, I urge an aye vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Discussion on the measure. Recognize Senator Weber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in favor of Senate Bill 710. Mr. President, since coming to the legislature in 2021, working for the betterment of children has been one of my key focuses. It was my focus as a teacher for 30 years. It was one of my focuses serving in local government, and it continues to be one of my primary focuses today. And that's why I support Senate Bill 710. There is no way that we can understand what a child who is in the center of a family dispute is going through. Often a child has experienced unimaginable trauma, domestic, mental, physical, and sexual abuse, and more. They desperately need help and someone to at least try to understand what they are going through and how to help. There is nothing more damaging to a child and a family who is experiencing this abuse than to have a judge who is, in theory, charged with their welfare, make decisions that they are completely counter to that welfare, even when the judge is well-meaning and simply acting out of ignorance. Senate Bill 710 gives a Chief Justice authority and instructs her to establish materials for education-based and trauma-informed continuing education for judges. Mr. President, our judges are educated in the law. However, when those lawyers become judges, it is often the case that they need expertise in more than just revised statutes and administrative rule. They need to make decisions for the protection of children who are counting on them to be their last chance for their protection. Senate Bill 710 will arm judges with the information that they need to do just that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Additional discussion? Seeing no additional discussion, Senator Sollman, do you wish to close? She does not. The question now arises upon the third reading and final passage of Senate Bill 710A. Those of you the opinion the bill should be passed will answer aye as their names are called. Those opposed, no. The clerk will please call the roll.
Nash. Patterson. Pham. Przonski. Reynolds. Robinson. Brock Smith. Sollman. Starr. Taylor. Thatcher. Weber. Woods. Anderson. Bonham. Broadman. Campos. Frederick. Gelser-Bluen. Gerard. Golden. Gorsuch. Hayden. Jama. Lieber. Linthicum. Manning. McLean. Meek. President Wagner.
Aye.
Excused. Thatcher. 29 ayes.
Senate Bill 710A, having received a constitutional majority, is declared passed.